For 2,000 years, one specific event in the life of Jesus has been used to justify human rage. We look at the moment Christ crafted a whip of cords, drove out the money changers, and flipped the tables in the temple courts, and we project our own anger onto him. But when we do that, we miss the profound difference between a defender and a dictator. Today, we are exploring a concept detailed in the Plain Gospel Bible series, Why Jesus Flipped Tables Without Becoming a Throne. We are going to look at why this act was not about ego, but protection, and how Christ demonstrated that confronting a corrupt system does not require building a new system around yourself.
The confusion begins when people mistake mercy for passivity. The modern cultural lens often reduces Jesus to a docile teacher who never raised his voice or challenged authority. When faced with the temple cleansing, readers struggle to reconcile a gentle Christ with a man overturning heavy wooden tables and driving livestock out of a sacred space. But true burden-lifting love requires resistance when the vulnerable are being harmed. If we understand the historical context of what was happening in Jerusalem, the flipping of the tables emerges as a defense of the marginalized, rather than a sudden loss of temper.
Let us examine that historical context. The setting is the Second Temple in Jerusalem during the Passover festival. According to historical records, the temple was the absolute center of Jewish religious and socio-political life. By the time Jesus arrived, this sacred space had been transformed into a bustling commercial hub. Pilgrims traveled immense distances to offer sacrifices, but they faced a system designed to exploit their devotion.
The exploitation was systematic and institutional. When these travelers arrived, they were required to pay a temple tax. However, the authorities only accepted the Tyrian shekel. This meant pilgrims carrying Roman or other foreign currency had to use the money changers stationed in the temple courts. These money changers charged exorbitant exchange rates, profiting off the spiritual obligations of ordinary people. Furthermore, merchants sold sacrificial animals like doves, which were the permitted offering for the poorest worshippers, at highly inflated prices. The religious system had weaponized access to God, turning it into a sacred market.
This concept of managed access is central to understanding the conflict. The priests and temple authorities acted as gatekeepers. They mandated the sacrifices, set the financial terms, and controlled the physical space. Significantly, this marketplace was set up in the court of the Gentiles, the only area where non-Jews were permitted to pray. The noise, the commerce, and the sheer chaos rendered the space useless for its intended purpose of prayer. The system alienated the outsider and impoverished the faithful.
Jesus saw a system that burdened the very people it was supposed to serve. In the Plain Gospel Bible framework, Christ's reaction is understood as an exposure of this religious exploitation. When Jesus braided the whip and drove out the sheep, the cattle, and the merchants, he dismantled a barrier that had been placed between God and humanity. He was not reacting out of vanity or generic outrage. He was engaging in a calculated, deliberate act of protection. He struck at the economic engine of a corrupt hierarchy that was crushing the poor.
The distinction between righteous confrontation and ordinary domination is crucial here. Throughout history, when leaders or revolutionaries confront a corrupt power structure, their ultimate goal is usually to seize the apparatus of power for themselves. They overthrow the king to sit on the throne. They flip the tables so they can set up their own tables and collect their own taxes. Yet Jesus exhibits a completely different model of authority.
He breaks the pattern. After driving out the exploiters and restoring the sanctity of the space, Jesus did not install his disciples as the new money changers. He did not occupy the temple and declare himself the new high priest of an alternative financial system. He cleared the space for prayer, healed the blind and the lame who came to him there, and then he left. He used force to interrupt a predatory cycle, but he refused to build a system of control around himself. This is the difference between sandals and thrones.
That phrase, the difference between sandals and thrones, captures the essence of his mission. Thrones require borders, guards, taxes, and enforced submission. They operate on the mechanics of managed access and hierarchical power. Sandals represent a mobile, accessible, burden-lifting love that moves among the people. When Jesus overturned the seats of those selling pigeons, the specific offering of the poor, he demonstrated that the holiness of God's house is fundamentally incompatible with the exploitation of the vulnerable.
The religious leaders of the day, particularly the Sadducees who controlled the temple operations, understood this threat perfectly. By quoting the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah, Jesus accused them of turning a house of prayer for all nations into a den of robbers. This was a direct theological and political indictment. He exposed the fact that they were masking their greed with piety. It was this exposure, this disruption of their lucrative sacred market that accelerated the plot to have him executed.
People often miss the deliberate nature of this act. The gospel accounts describe him making a whip of cords. Creating a whip takes time. It requires sitting down, gathering materials, and braiding them together. This detail proves it was not a sudden, uncontrollable outburst of rage. It was a premeditated, solemn judgment against a system that harmed people in the name of worship. The anger of Christ is always tethered to love. It is provoked when those he loves are hindered or abused.
And that redefines how we must view righteous anger. Generic outrage is often self-centered, focused on defending one's own honor or preferences. Righteous confrontation is entirely outward-focused. Jesus did not flip the tables because someone insulted him. He overturned the system because it was standing on the necks of the poor. The Plain Gospel Bible highlights this dynamic to show that defending the defenseless sometimes requires interrupting the status quo. You cannot claim to love the oppressed while remaining polite to the systems that oppress them.
This forces us to evaluate our own responses to injustice. When modern individuals attempt to emulate the table-flipping Jesus, they often fail the test of the aftermath. They confront corruption, but then they establish themselves as the new moral authorities, demanding the very submission they just condemned. How does Christ's example teach us to defend people without becoming what we oppose?
It requires an ongoing surrender of the desire to control. Jesus fought for the liberation of the worshipers, not for the expansion of his own earthly empire. He refused the temptation to dominate. To defend people without becoming what we oppose, we must ensure our actions are motivated by love for the vulnerable, rather than a desire to punish our enemies or elevate our own status. The goal of confrontation must be restoration and freedom, not a transfer of power.
The contrast is stark. The temple authorities demanded silver half shekels to grant access to the divine presence. Jesus provided access freely, offering living water without price. The system required people to carry heavy burdens. Jesus invited people to take his yoke, which is easy and light. When he cleared the temple, he was stripping away the artificial burdens men had attached to God. He dismantled the transactional nature of the religious market to restore a relational dynamic.
This action foreshadowed a massive theological shift. The temple, with its sacrifices and barriers, was a temporary structure pointing to a permanent reality. Jesus himself was the true temple, the ultimate meeting place between God and humanity. By disrupting the physical temple, he signaled that the era of managed geographical access to God was ending. The curtain was going to be torn. The presence of God would no longer be confined behind walls guarded by profit-seeking gatekeepers.
We see the legacy of this moment and how the early Christian community functioned. They did not build grand temples or establish complex taxation systems for access to grace. They met in homes, shared their resources, and cared for the poor. They understood that their leader had rejected the throne in favor of the cross. But over the centuries, the institutional church has frequently forgotten this lesson, falling back into the pattern of sacred markets and managed access.
Every time religious systems begin to charge a toll for grace, whether through financial demands, rigid cultural conformities, or the accumulation of political power, they recreate the tables of the money changers. The spirit of the temple merchants is alive whenever leaders exploit the spiritual hunger of their followers for personal gain. The Plain Gospel Bible challenges us to recognize these modern tables and to understand that Jesus remains opposed to any structure that monetizes or restricts access to the Father.
The image of the overturned tables is a warning to those in power and a comfort to those that are burdened. It proves that God is not indifferent to exploitation. It demonstrates that true mercy possesses a spine of steel when the vulnerable are threatened. Jesus stood in the center of the religious establishment, confronted its highest authorities, disrupted their economy, and walked away without taking their crown. He flipped the tables, but he refused the throne.
That is the ultimate takeaway. True power, divine power, does not need to hoard authority to prove its strength. It can dismantle a corrupt system and then stoop down to heal a beggar in the very same hour. Christ's table flipping was the fiercest expression of his protective love. It was a defense of the holiness of God and the dignity of the poor. He broke the pattern of human domination, leaving us a perfect model of courageous, selfless confrontation.
By understanding this context, we separate the profound actions of Jesus from the selfish anger of men. He showed us that love must sometimes interrupt, expose, and resist. But he also showed us that the victory is found in walking away from the temptation to rule the ashes. Send this episode to a friend who appreciates exploring the deep, challenging truths found in the life of Jesus.